Everyone, and welcome to NUPI on this sort of grey and wet day. I'm very happy to see that you have turned up here, and also a hearty welcome to our online audience, those joining us via our live broadcast. My name is Helge Blokkesrud. I'm a senior researcher here at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and also an associate professor at the University of Oslo. And the last 4 years I had the pleasure to be the principal investigator of a joint Norwegian-Georgian project implemented between the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and the Georgian Institute of Politics in Tbilisi. Called Competency Through Cooperation, Advancing Knowledge on Georgia's Strategic Path. This project has consisted of 2 interconnected strands, competency building and research cooperation. So in the first strand, in the competency building part, we have, among other things, organized a series of masterclasses for PhD students in Georgia on how to write academic articles. And in the research cooperation, it's been more traditional cooperation, but focusing on also joint publication, including both Norwegian and Georgian researchers. Now we are at the very final leg of this project. We're wrapping up in a month and a half. And this will be the last event here in Oslo for a Norwegian audience with this seminar and some meetings. Then we will have present the findings for an international audience in Chicago next month. And we'll have a final event in Tbilisi with a book launch sponsored by the project in early December. But this is where we are trying now to wrap up some of the insights that we have gained during this work over the last 4 years. I said that the title was Advancing Knowledge on Georgia's Strategic Path. And we have been interested in looking at Georgia between the EU and Russia and the interrelations between the three, as well as also in some of our publications joining Abkhazia and South Ossetia to this equation. And if you look at the title of the seminar, it might look a bit provocative maybe, or maybe pessimistic, depending on how you see it. But we have called it Georgia at a Crossroads. Is Tbilisi losing its strategic compass, with a question mark? And to try to explain what we mean by that and where we feel that we stand today, we have 2 project participants with immense knowledge of Georgian politics. It's Professor Kornely Kakachia from the Tbilisi State University and also director of the Georgian Institute of Politics, our project partner, and Ketevan Bolkvadze, who is an associate senior lecturer at Lund University in Sweden. And the order of the day will be that we'll start with Kornely, who will focus on the international dimension. He will speak for 15 minutes. If you speak longer, I'll try to stop you. And then give the floor to Kete, who will cover the domestic part of the picture. And then we'll have a conversation, hopefully also involving you in an extended Q&A session. But without further ado, I would then like to invite you, Kornely, to start with trying to explain why did we put this title on today's seminar.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Helge, having me here. It's always nice to be at NUPI, and I've been here for a few years ago, and it was really great cooperation we started, and I think this was quite important for Georgian scholars as well as for Norwegians, I hope. As far as the title of our today's conversation is that when we were choosing this title, it's not just to provoke the audience just to come for this event, but really we mean it, because the people who watching Georgian politics, they got a little bit fed up with this title, Georgia at Crossroads, almost like every 5 years, and then now that's why we decided this memo, which I wrote together with my colleague. It says Georgia from crossroad to crossroad, because that's a little bit change. But basically, problem is that, as you know, Georgia is unconsolidated democracy. It's just aspiring democracy, and because of that, country actually facing serious problem internally, externally. Today, I will speak more about external challenges, and maybe I'll start with this unfortunate war in Ukraine. After Russian invasion of Ukraine, basically we changed completely the security environment around in Georgia, and also regional security. When I say regional, I mean Black Sea security, Eastern Partnership, I don't know, even South Caucasus, whatever you like. So, of course, this has a huge effect on Georgia and on Georgian security, because, as you know, Georgia was after 2008 war with Russia. Georgia was very, vulnerable to in many ways. If you look around regionally, Georgia, especially after Nagorno-Karabakh war, felt a little bit more isolated, and I'll just explain you why. If you look to the Georgia's neighbors, Azerbaijan has its own ally, Turkey, and we know that how important was this alignment during the war. And then Armenia also has its ally, Russia, formally, and I'm saying formally because it didn't really pay off during the war, as we know. And then Georgia, which was last 30 years very pro-Western, it just stands alone because it's not a member of NATO. It's just aspirant. It just got now this European perspective, which is not a candidate status, unlike Ukraine and Moldova. So, and also Georgia doesn't have anything like the NATO fifth chapter or anything which will kind of secure its own security. So that's why Georgian security is in many ways in limbo, and that's why it's more vulnerable to any pressure from any neighbors, including Russia. So when I say about pressure, we should not always think about the military means, but that's also, of course, not excluded now. But also, what I mean is authoritarian pressure, because if you look at Georgia's neighborhood, you see that Georgia is, as I said, Georgia is not a consolidated democracy, but Georgia was still doing better than other neighbors there. But now, if you look more, Georgia looks now a little bit kind of island, which also has its own authoritarian kind of sentiments now, but also surrounding of the Georgia, doesn't really support the democratization of the country. And of course, this war in Ukraine changed completely Georgia's, security predicament. After 2008 war, Georgia lost almost, its navy, and it doesn't have. And if tomorrow Russia decides to attack Georgia, Georgia is very vulnerable in that many ways. And as you know now, I don't think that anybody can predict that, Russia will not do it, because we kind of crossed that point, because now none of the neighbors of Russia, maybe except NATO members, are immune for this, and there are several scenarios even. We actually, a few months ago, we wrote several scenarios where we assessed Georgia's risk assessment, and the best scenario was called Georgian Dream, and Georgian Dream was meaning that Ukraine will prevail in this war, and then Russia loses. Even this scenario had one risk for Georgia, because, as you know, in 2 years there's an election in Russia, and if Russia loses this war, and it looks like this is happening, this could be quite dangerous for Georgia because, as you know, Putin's regime is always depending on public support, and when he wins this war, he always has the high ratings. And if he loses this war in Ukraine, Georgia or even Kazakhstan could be next good target. And as you know, Russia has a lot of unfinished business in Georgia because in 2008 war they could not. They occupied 2 regions of Georgia, but they didn't manage to change drastically the political landscape there. So in that sense, Georgia is quite vulnerable. But another challenge, which is also a huge problem now, that Georgia actually, which was kind of seen as a permanent laboratory of change last decades, and that was one of the reasons why Western governments were supporting Georgia, because Georgia doesn't have, even though we claim that we have very important geopolitical location, which can be partially true, but it's not was the main thing, because Georgia doesn't have, unlike Azerbaijan, oil or gas or anything to attract somebody, but Georgia had this image of the permanent reforms, center of permanent reforms, but unfortunately Georgia is losing now this image, and probably Katie will talk about this more, about these internal challenges, but there's also external challenge, which is actually related, is both of them, because of this backsliding now we have in Georgia, Georgia didn't get the candidate status, and this is very unfortunate, and I would say it's a very missed opportunity for many Georgians, because Georgia was front runner in Eastern Partnership among the associated trio, which includes Ukraine and Moldova, for many years. And if you look to the technical parameters like fulfillment of association agreement, Georgia is still doing okay. Georgia almost fulfilled like 40% of this association agreement. But when war started, this very peculiar attitude of Georgian government towards Ukraine and some other, I would say, strategic mistakes, and I think really, challenged the Georgia's image, and I would say Georgia's image now in Western, among Western partners, little bit shattered. And I think this was also the result. This also resulted that Georgia got a European perspective, which is still okay. For instance, if somebody would tell me 5 years ago, GAP together with some other, with our Ukrainian and Moldovan, like colleagues, we were advocating in Paris, in Berlin, we're talking about European perspective, and people don't want to listen about this at all. But now, at this window opportunity which was opened up by Ukrainian events, this is true. But thing is that when our colleagues from Moldova and Ukraine, they moved basically with 2 steps, Georgia just moved 1 step. And there's also some certain risks because if Georgia will be falling out from this associated trio, this may bring Georgia not in very good situation, because if you look at the Georgian foreign policy trajectory last decades, Georgia was trying to attach itself more to Eastern Europe and disassociate itself from South Caucasus because of the ongoing war in Nagorno-Karabakh. And as you know, Georgians, we are not really well known for strategic patience, and I'm sure you know that. And we simply don't want it until wait until our neighbors will finish this war. And also there was a challenge in terms of democracy in our neighborhood. So that's why Georgia was trying a little bit to kind of escape from the region. As you know, geographically that's not possible, but like politically this was, and Georgia almost made it because now we are firmly attached to this, at least before this, to this associated trio, but it's not guaranteed. So that's why I think that what Georgia now really needs to get this candidate status, even though there's a lot of question marks now how this should be done. As you know, European Union gave Georgia and also other countries at these 12 points which Georgia needs fulfill. One of them is the oligarchization, the polarization, and then some other issues related, rule of law and some other things. But major problem we see there, and Katie will talk about this more details, that there's no political will now, at least at this moment, internally. And of course, this also affects Georgia's external image, and I think, and as you know, in 2 years we have a parliamentary election, and now we have a government which is already 3rd term. And I think this is also a little bit reflects this internal and external situation. And Georgia in a way in a crossroad, because at some point it cannot afford to alienate its strategic partners in the West. I understand that Georgian government is trying to balance, and they try what I would call accommodate Russian strategic interests, not to irritate Russia, but it doesn't pay off much. At least they started it from 2012, and now what is the risk that, and we saw that what is happening with Ukraine, that basically if you, and this rhetoric which Georgian government now actually started against Western partners, including the criticizing EU and US ambassadors, this never happened before. This is unprecedented. And I understand that, yes, there's a quite strong argument that Georgia doesn't have these guarantees, for security guarantees from the West, but I can ask also opposite question, that if Georgia will be in trouble, I don't know, next month or next years, then who is going to help Georgia? It's true that we are not member of NATO, but alternatively, who is going to help? This is again Western partners, and if you alienate them, then I mean, who will support Georgia? China, Turkey, Iran? I don't think so. So I think here we are kind of in limbo, and I think this is that's why it's very decisive. What will be the Georgia's trajectory in the future? And I think, and this is probably last from my side, role of civil society and role of like the public is very important, because public is very pro-European. They want to push for reforms, but as you know, sometimes it's not easy, to push the governments to make some changes. Maybe I'll stop here, and then I'll be more than happy to continue with Q&A.
Yes, I think that provided a good bridge over to you, Kete, and the domestic scene, and also what Kornely was mentioning about the oligarchization and depolarization of the domestic scene. So, please.
Right, thank you. So basically, building on what Kornely has been discussing, I will zero in on the internal political dynamics, which really have been an important contributor to why Georgia seems like stuck at the crossroads and not really moving towards the EU integration path, basically. So I'll try to stick to 12, 13 minutes, max 15.
Yeah.
I might push it a bit. But I will basically, I'll try to touch upon three aspects which I think are really key to understanding the internal challenges. And that is, of course, de-oligarchization, or rather the problem of oligarchization, and D is something that's required from us. Secondly, depolarization also, and sort of basically lack of party institutionalization, which means that basically parties do not trust each other, and this makes it very, very difficult for them to come together and think about the long-term strategic solutions to the problems. And thirdly, I will also try to touch upon some of the solutions and also ways out of this deadlock. Again, many of you who have been following Georgian politics are probably aware of the fact that in June this year, Georgia was given 6 months to implement 12 reform priorities in order to receive the EU candidate status. And, these reform priorities are all quite extensive, quite elaborate, but one of them is really the key to kickstarting reforms also in other areas. And that is something that the EU very specifically, very concretely wrote down as de-oligarchization. So it was really with black on white. And why? Because in the recent years, key state institutions have been essentially put in service of country's single richest man, who also happens to be the founder and informal leader of the ruling party. Because of that, transparency of policymaking, accountability of state institutions, rule of law have unfortunately been eroded, and checks and balances are also unfortunately very, very weak. And someone might ask, why is it such a problem? Because we know that there are democracies where extreme wealth holders are involved in politics, right? And I mean, we know this is a problem in the US and also in some Western democracies. But I would say those democracies at least include some impartial institutions, impartial bureaucracy to start with, which restrains the power that these wealthy individuals exert on policymaking. However, in young democracies like Georgia, we have fragile institutions because these institutions did not have time to mature enough. And unfortunately, these fragile institutions have allowed the oligarchs to not only ascend to power, but essentially to turn politics into a transactional game where they pursue private gain at the expense of the public interest. And this results in states' loss of autonomy vis-a-vis the wealthy few who are interested not only in the protection of their assets, but also in extending their assets, in often state plunder, in extracting rents. And this is, of course, this is something that's not, that's not only a problem in Georgia. This has been prevalent in Ukraine. Ukrainian oligarchs are very, very famous. This was a problem in Moldova. But while we've seen some positive developments in Ukraine and Moldova, of course, we still have to see what's going to happen in Ukraine after the war. They have to fulfill also de-oligarchization norms. But Moldova has seen some very, very positive changes with Plahotniuc, the oligarch, essentially gone, with Maya Sandu's government. So there has been some positive changes, but Georgia has not seen those changes, unfortunately, yet. And because of that, it still continues to qualify as a hybrid regime where oligarchic ruling party tilts the political playing field. And of course, this stands in sharp contrast to the Copenhagen criteria, which states have to fulfill in order to join the European Union, to become the members, and to start with, to become the candidates of membership. The second problem is something that the EU also calls polarization. So there's a complete lack of trust between the parties, and especially between the ruling party on the one hand and opposition parties on the other hand. And this has unfortunately very deep roots because in the last 30 years in Georgia, essentially the winning party has been going against the losing party. And this was, there has been this sort of vendetta mindset or approach between the political leaders. So if basically in established democracies, there's uncertainty about who is going to win the elections, in young democracies like Georgia, in hybrid regimes, there's uncertainty about what is going to happen to the party if they lose the elections, because they either completely disappear from the political arena or they become targets of intimidation by the new party of power. If you follow Georgian politics, you probably have heard about what's going on with ex-president Saakashvili, who is in prison and whose health is not in a very good shape. And I think that there's also this sort of implicit understanding between the existing ruling party members, or at least the elites, that if they would lose power, the same would happen to them. And I think they also have some good reasons for that, because in 2012, when they were in opposition, they were actually very much targeted by politicized police. And of course, this vendetta approach makes it very, very difficult for parties to come together and put aside their immediate short-term survival interests and think about the long-term strategic interests of the country, something that Kornely was talking about, right? And this is something that I'd be happy to elaborate more so during the Q&A session. But in the end of the day, of course, the big question is, for Georgia's EU path at least, the big question is how to make the ruling party interested in pursuing the rule of law reforms, something that's required from Georgia to become the EU candidate. So why would a dominant party care about creating a system when they are the fair system, when they are the ones benefiting from unfair political playing field, right? This sort of seems to counter the rational logic of self-preservation, if we look from very political science perspective. However, I'm quite hopeful because there are some young democracies where politics, party politics, had been similarly dominated by, oligarchs, big men, but which have pursued rule of law reforms. And basically, the short answer to the question above is the logic of insurance. And the logic behind this is that ruling elites in danger of losing office fear finding themselves on the receiving end of politicized justice. And this fear prompts them to insulate institutions, courts, police, law enforcement from political pressure to protect themselves from future intimidation. So basically, they depoliticize institutions today as a form of insurance not to face politicized institutions tomorrow when they are in opposition. And again, we've seen this in many young democracies, including in Mexico in 1990s under PRI, which very much resembled the current ruling elite in Georgia, tilting the political playing field. However, there's an important precondition, and that is that parties should expect to survive in opposition to think about long-term insurance. And I think, and this is my last point, I think this is something that the EU, US, and all the other international donors should really focus on basically changing and mitigating this insecure political environment and making sure that even when out of power, parties survive and stay on the political arena just to think about the long-term interests. And of course, it's difficult given the vendetta approach, but I'm a strong believer that this is the only way to turn the vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle and to really get parties interested in coming together and putting aside their short-term partisan interests and prioritizing long-term strategic interests of the country. I'll stop there.
Yeah. We will shortly open up the floor here for questions, and for those of us that follow us online, it's also possible to use the chat function to send in questions. But let me just start with a follow-up to you, Kete. You ended on a semi-optimistic note, which is good. But do you, at this stage, see any signs of willingness to give this insurance, or to work to depoliticize and prepare for a life in opposition? Isn't it very much the opposite we are seeing in Tbilisi these days?
Unfortunately, I have to agree. Probably right now there are not signs of that in the ruling party. But the thing is, there are signs of that in opposition.
Yeah.
And of course, the former ruling party, which lost power in 2012, many of the leaders have been talking about how they, including Saakashvili, how they regretted not insulating courts to start with. So once you lose power, you really start to value how important it is to have impartial institutions that will be there to protect you.
But a bit late.
But a bit too late, unfortunately. But I still think that I think the existing ruling party wants to obviously clinch to power, but I think part of the reason is also this fear, that's the fear of insecurity, basically. And I think that if there would be some sort of guarantees between the parties that would be, I don't know, mediated through the involvement of EU, other donors, that, there would be guarantees that whoever would win the elections would not go against GD. I think that would at least take off some of the tensions from at least from some of the members, and maybe that would create a platform to, allow power sharing. Of course, there are hardliners who would not want to give up power, but I still think that if they would see themselves staying on the political arena, there's a chance. Otherwise, we will just continue going around this vicious cycle.
So you need some insurance, and you need a certain level of trust that the other players will play a according to the rules. Yeah.
And probably someone who can guarantee this.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid in this case, I don't think that parties really trust the civil society, or civil society is not as strong. So I'm afraid it has to be someone who is sort of outsider and external.
And that leads me to a follow-up question to you. And please also start to sign up for those who want to ask questions here. But an outsider, Ketevan says, and you talked about Georgia's image. And Georgia used to have a very good image. It was the best in the class when it came to fulfilling what the EU demanded, you said. But it has been difficult from someone observing from the outside then to understand Georgia's behavior after 24th of February and its approach to the sanctions regime and what has been unfolding in Ukraine. Could you just elaborate briefly on that? Try to explain to us why did the government choose this path?
Probably will start that probably we should not call it behavior, probably misbehavior, because that's the probably right word.
To be because, a diplomat.
Because this actually, like attitude, especially towards Ukraine, was actually catastrophic for Georgia's image. Of course, we understand that there's internal reasons. There's a Saakashvili's factor which spoiled this Ukrainian-Georgian relations. But when you are a ruling party, you should not the bilateral.
Can you just elaborate briefly on that in case people don't
okay.
About the Saakashvili factor here.
Yeah, and Saakashvili's factor, as you know, the former president of Georgia was. He's kind of very interesting person in many ways. He was promoting himself kind of like post-Soviet kind of Che Guevara also, or Simon de Bolivar, who actually is politician in Ukraine and in Georgia. As you know, he was a politician in Georgia, and then he became a Ukrainian citizen, and he was in his party had quite strong links there, and especially with the present Ukrainian government for obvious reason. And when actually he left to Georgia, he already had state position in Ukraine. So that's of course like also influenced this bilateral relations, but the problem is that I think this is a weakness of Georgian dream because, first of all, bilateral interstate relations should not be depending on personalities. It should be institutionalized so much that whoever person is that, it cannot be rested. And I think that was the weakness of the Georgian diplomacy and Georgian government. And I think this had some impact on this, but also I think what many Georgians believe that Georgia's government is, first of all, I think maybe they don't want it this, but it looks like they look to the reaction of Russia. So they try to accommodate Russian interests, not to irritate. And this is open policy, starting from 2012, when this, founder of the Georgian Dream, he said that we don't want to see Georgia a kind of like place between place of the conflicts between West and East. So I think they kind of play some sort of like kind of realpolitik, and sometimes I feel this, the John Mearsheimer is kind of like advising Georgian government, how to do these things. But it was very unfortunate time, actually, and very wrong decision because the problem is that everybody understands that when you have two occupied regions in Georgia, you may not be able all the time to pursue value-based foreign policy, especially if you're a small state. But the thing is that when your foreign policy is based on the Euro-Atlantic path, and basically you have this enshrined in your constitution, and then when there's a major crisis with your strategic partner, with Ukraine, and you have this ambiguous statement from the governmental officials, which actually nobody understands, neither Ukrainians, neither. And I want to make clear that it's not, we're talking about Georgian government stance, not about the society. Society very strongly supports Ukraine, and they don't have ambiguities. And then also this attacking these Western diplomats and basically talking that like they want to drag Georgia into war. I mean, how is that logical? Because as we already know, European Union located already, I think, more than 10 years, I think, mission, which is the only observer mission after Russia kicked out OSCE and UN from Georgia. And how come that European Union wants to drag Georgia, which is absolutely unprepared, and why should, I mean, if Georgia even it will start conflict, Georgia will need support. It will be second headache after Ukraine. So I don't know, but I think this roots of this, rhetoric is actually internal politics, as, Katie highlighted, and because they are so much now focused on this to clinch the power at any cost, they don't care anymore about what US or European Union say, and there's some sort of understanding that they even try to kind of, how to say, blackmail a little bit West, like with this kind of statement that they should not, whatever they call, interfere in Georgian internal affairs. And they talk like kind of Russia, maybe like 10 years ago when they were talking about sovereign democracy or something. That's worries a lot of Georgians and not also Georgians. So that's why we have this, problem. And now, as Katie said, when we're talking about Crossroads, if these problems will not be solved like internally, and one of the major problem is that which Georgia faces now is that Georgia, we as the Georgians, we have to, we have to understand that we should be able to solve the problems we create. And we cannot be depending on all the time, help from EU or United States. If you want to make a stable democracy, I think we have to learn, and that comes from this party politics. And unfortunately, we are not there yet.
Yeah, we'll come back to the party politics, but we have a couple of questions in the audience. So, Tom, if you will give the mic, pass the mic, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jakub. Jakub Godzimirski from NUPI. Thank you very much for two very interesting introductions. I have been studying Russian politics at NUPI since 1995. Being Polish, I have also been following Polish politics, and I see that Georgia is somehow in the same place where Poland used to be in like 1996, because it was this whole debate about the way ahead for Poland joining NATO, joining the European Union, and this question of EU and NATO conditionality played a major part in Polish politics, which is also most probably the case in the Georgian politics nowadays. But there is a good outlook and some bad outlook. Good outlook is that Polish political parties that came from very different parts of the political spectrum, also with some historical issues, managed to reach a kind of strategic consensus on the way ahead until Poland joined NATO in 1999 and the European Union in 2004. But it turned out that even after joining both NATO and the EU, this question of polarization, insurance policy has not disappeared, because if you look at the Polish politics today, this really reminds a lot of what you have been talking about Georgia, the need to have this insurance against losing election and so on and so on. So it would be good to join NATO and the EU, but it is not going to solve all the problems. This is the conclusion.
Advice from the Polish side. Yes, so there are obviously stumbling blocks also in the future, but why is it not possible then to get this strategic consensus, to move forward together to reach these greater goals? Why is the polarization between the parties so deep in Georgia?
Right. I'll start with your point that I agree that there's always a risk of backsliding, and of course what we see in Poland and Hungary is a clear example of that. But I think as someone who has been sort of studying and then teaching EU politics in the last 8 years, I'm still absolutely in awe of the power of EU conditionality, and that majority of reforms in the Central and Eastern European countries were pursued exactly in preparation for the membership. And so I think we should just not underestimate the power. Of course, there's a risk of backsliding, but I'd be still happy to get Georgia to the point where Poland is right now, where at least parties talk to each other, and there is no this very deep animosity and distrust. Of course, there will always be sort of power-hungry elites who want to maximize their power, but I still believe in the power of EU conditionality. And to get to your point, Helge, why there's so much mistrust. I think there are essentially two reasons and two big problems for that. There's mistrust between the parties on the one hand, and the reasons what we just talked about. And there's also distrust, so horizontal distrust, and there's also vertical distrust between the electorate and the political parties. And why? Because parties are usually just like in many other young democracies, these are not sort of bottom-up, grassroots creations. These are creations of sort of, again, big men and oligarchs who create these parties to participate in politics and often to protect their interests, essentially, to protect their assets in many cases, and to extend their assets. So these are not these are usually vehicles for oligarchic interests and big men. And I think that has very much sort of also weakened, or has not at least helped to create trust between the electorate and the ruling party. And it's also the fact that because in the last 30 years, whoever would come into power eventually would have slightly have authoritarian tendencies. Of course, there's this massive thinking that basically the next party will be just like the previous one. So this complete, often detachment from politics, and that politics is seen, you would hear many people talking, oh, I'm apolitical, because they see that's something that's really dirty, because that's how parties have been operating, unfortunately.
We have a couple of more questions here, but just let me return briefly to conditionality. You believe in conditionality, but do you see a willingness to implement these 12 points on the side of the Georgian government now? Are they working hard and diligently to fulfill these conditions, or are they just muddling through? One of you said clinging to power.
Yeah, maybe let me start. I think formally, if you ask each of the side, I mean, opposition or like a ruling party, they say that they are ready, and they started some sort of commission, some sort of grouping where they're discussing. But unfortunately, they're doing this separately. This is not a synchronized process. This is what EU told them. It's not to work independently, but to work together, because that's the polarization. It's not like when you have two channels and they don't communicate. And I think, unfortunately, what I see, there is no political will, neither from both sides. And as I wrote in this memo, I think that one of the reasons probably that is that opposition sees that if they will be involved in this, fulfilling this association agreement, and they will cooperate with government, they're thinking about the future next election, and they think that they may lose this election, because then this ruling party, which is already third term, they will even more consolidate, and then government also thinks that if they will fulfill all these 12 points, then they may lose the power. So basically, none of them actually is willing to engage in sincere dialogue, and I think that's also one of the obstacles why it's not possible. But of course, certainly there will be some topics which will be, which is possible to work on together. But like issues of the oligarchization, the polarization, it's not even defined. What is that? Because according to government, it doesn't apply to the Bizina Ivanishvili, the founder of the party, and it just applies to the opposition leaders. and according to opposition leaders, this is vice versa. So I think we don't have a one definition about this.
Right. Yeah, just like Kornely mentioned, they created a committee or commission at the parliament, right, to fulfill the 12 reform priorities, but it only includes essentially the ruling party members. Unfortunately, they also went ahead with, this was slightly earlier, but they went ahead with the appointment of Supreme Court justices. And that was something that the US government and also the EU was very much pushing for to avoid, and that's there would be qualified judges appointed. So yes, it's difficult to see right now any positive changes, but I still think that if there would be, there would have some guarantees especially the ruling party, that they would not be just targeted in opposition. There is some chance for gaining.
Okay, next one out.
My name is Christian Gjerde. I work here at NUPI. I have a question about Georgian public opinion and domestic discourse. You say that the political debate is very polarized. And I have two linked questions. First is, what is the position of Saakashvili today as a person and political figure? And the second, my second question is, how does what are the ways in which that Georgians look back at the Saakashvili era? Because I know it's an historical era. He has been out of office almost as long as he was in office. So yeah.
First,
I can start.
please.
So Saakashvili recently, or his representatives recently, made a statement that he essentially wants to leave the Georgian politics. And there have been some discussions on that. That's maybe just to leave or avoid the continuous persecution and to return to Ukrainian politics. We'll see how ruling party reacts to that. But when it comes to how public looks back, I think there are those who appreciate all the fantastic reforms that he really pursued, especially in the first 2-3 years of his tenure. But there are also people who highlight the authoritarian tendencies, politicized institutions, politicized police and law enforcement. So I would say it's a mixed bag. But he still has lots of supporters. And UNM still continues to be the largest opposition party. So that tells you something, that he still has quite some supporters.
Yeah, I think, I mean, he's very, he has a very controversial legacy, even though he may not think it's a legacy, because he still thinks that, at least until recently, he was thinking that he's still the Georgian politician. And I think that one of the biggest problem is that in Georgia, that how to say, people don't know when they should leave the politics. This happened with Shevardnadze when he lost the power because of that, actually. The same thing was for him. So I think I understand that, when he became president, he was very young. And that then, people probably, it's very difficult to say because we don't know, we didn't never have served in public office, but you have to understand that in order to leave your legacy, good legacy, you really need to behave like a democratic politician. Unfortunately, this is my private opinion, he was a reformer, but he was never a Democrat. So I think this also reflected his party, and that was one of the reasons also his party split several times, and now, I don't know, even right now they have some sort of crisis, even though they are probably the biggest opposition parties. So I think in that sense, he could have actually done a lot of good things if he would resign, as a leader of the UNM, and if he would really support, if he would be just kind of public figure for Georgia, I don't know, doing something else. But I think this is not in Georgian political rules, unfortunately, and that's why we have this, even this polarization which we talk about, it's not really classical type of polarization like you see in the West when it is ideologically driven. It's mostly driven along these lines like Saakashvili versus Ivanishvili, and this is even this polarization is fake in many ways. So I think this also, and this also doesn't give the Georgian democracy to have more to have more institutionalized, like the parties or in a system, and I think that's why we actually have these huge problems related to internal politics.
So, because of the way this polarization is structured, it's not like there would be a solution that it come up a third force in the middle, because this is about personalities and personal ambitions, and not about ideology or and ambitions for Georgia.
Yeah, actually, there was a lot of attempts from opposition. We even have a party, several, who actually positioned themselves as a third force. But that this playing field is so uneven when the ruling party has a huge support financially, and that they enjoying also, like support from state institutions during the election. And there's a problem of vote buying and some other, infringement of during the election. I don't think that anybody has a real chance, even though there's some sort of, we have a lot of undecided voters who actually got fed up with these old faces. And one of the success actually of the ruling party is that they have opposition this former ruling party. That's also one of the reasons why they try to, misuse this. And because when they criticize, for instance, the current government, people don't believe because they were doing exactly the same sometimes when they were in their, in the government. So that's also one of the reasons what Kati mentioned here of distrust. Like in order to have this change, you have to have at least different people or at least different party who doesn't have this, baggage of the very heavy baggage.
Yeah. Question here in the front.
Mitt navn Torben Holt. I'm sorry, I'm speaking English.
Yes.
My name is Torben Holt. I'm an ordinary Norwegian pensioner, but I'm interested in this topic. And I've been to Georgia and Armenia once. Very interesting area and also very complicated, as you said, with who is these three countries, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, who is friend and who is enemy with whom, and the neighbors, of course. So my question goes really on the military preparations in a way. How strong is really the Georgian military forces? If not quite comparable, in Scandinavia we have, during the last 20 years, we've seen that Norway and Sweden have lowered their military budgets, while Finland has kept it, because they have a long border against Russia and I know what can happen. Russia is not trustable in a way. So my question is really, how strong are the Georgian forces? Who is delivering the weapons? And is there any, do you have any idea about, could anybody help you if worse comes to worse?
Yeah, that's quite legitimate question. Actually, we had recently discussion with GAP, public discussion after the war started. Can Georgia defend itself? And that was open question because government actually doesn't doesn't communicate with the public how Georgia should defend. They just say on the level of head of government that Russia will not attack us. But how do you know? I mean, nobody has this guarantee, even Finland or anybody. So, and it gives some sort of, how to say, chances to these conspiracy theories that they have some informal links with Russia. Then how do you know that Russia is not going to attack? Because there's no such guarantee. And unfortunately, Georgia is not ready, I think, from that sense, because if you look to military budget, it was shrinking year in year. And of course, even if Georgia would have, the biggest, sums used for military purposes, it cannot balance Russia, and we know that. But what Georgia really needs is Georgia needs to have a little bit stronger interoperability with our NATO partners, and especially with Turkey, because that's you like it or not, that's the only neighbor actually who can play important role if there is a major crisis in Georgia. And pretty much if there will be, I hope there will not be such a scenario for Georgia, but if there will be kind of major crisis in Georgia, so then you should consider Turkey playing role like Poland plays now for Ukraine. But do we have now relations between two countries in that level that, first of all, is Turkey willing to play that role? And then is Georgia also ready? And also, I think there's a lot of open questions, and we still don't have answer. And that's why a little bit of public worries, because the policy to accommodate Russian interests and what I called in my previous article, Finlandization of Georgian foreign policy, I think this is not really answer to the present Russian aggression, because again, I mean, we don't have any guarantees. We don't know what will be the decision of Mr. Putin tomorrow regarding any neighbors. And I think just to behave like this ostrich who just puts the head, in the sand, and you just think that, okay, there's nothing happening. I think this is not really wise and prudent, and that's why this worries a lot of friends of Georgia. And there was even talk recently among Western friends of Georgia that they should maybe help Georgia and Moldova as well militarily to at least to have resistance a little bit more. And of course, Georgia cannot fight alone, but at least. But we don't see the appetite from government that they are really willing to use this opportunity to get this kind of help and partially because of this policy, because they don't want to irritate Russia. So, and all this policy basically brings to the image of Georgia that Russia actually informally already gained informal power on Georgian foreign policy, because now if something is happening, Georgian government first thinks what will be the reaction of Russia, which is kind of like Finland was doing during Cold War for many years. And I mean, you cannot say this is unimportant or whatever, but it's also backfires the Georgia's image, especially right now when you have this backsliding and all these related problems.
Should we take the next question?
Hi, my name is Mikael Hem. I work for Forsvarets Forum, a defense news publication. So my questions is a bit related to this one. You said that the security situation in Georgia has changed because of the war in Ukraine. And I would like if you could elaborate a bit on that. In which ways has it changed, and has it given any, in which way has it caused any more danger or opportunities perhaps for Georgia? And how will it change maybe the opinion in the civil society?
Yeah, I think, as I said, this resilience of Georgia is under question, because this is also not completely related to what Georgia does. It's also a little bit, impact of the Western policies or having no policy towards the region. Because after 2008, we see less and less engagement from Western powers. And during this Karabakh war, we saw that EU just didn't care about the war. War just finished and they didn't even, have much influence there. And same applies to US. And I think this also, and also if you look, US foreign policy towards region, starting from Obama, when he started after Russian-Georgian war, this so-called reset policy, and then Trump's this transactional policy. Of course, this didn't help Georgia much, because, many Georgians just saw that, at the end of the day, if there is a crisis and if there is a conflict with Russia, they are on their own. And of course, this also had some impact, because Georgia was first victim of this aggression. And when Georgians were talking about the Russians' strategic visions, I remember that time, and I was in Finland. People were laughing, because it was easy to blame Georgians or their president that they were the part of the game as well. But now it's clear that Georgians were quite correct, because it was not about, this war was not about Georgia. It is about how Mr. Putin sees future of Russia. He wants not to, rebuild the Soviet Union. He doesn't want that. He wants to rebuild Russian Empire of 19th century. And we see this from the statements of Mr. Medvedev, when he sees that, Georgia was not existed as a state. There was two governors, Kutaisi and Tbilisi governors. So, and all this kind of talk that there's no nation like Ukrainian. So where does this lead? It leads like 19th century, like Russian Empire. I think this puts a lot of danger for country, so you and especially when you have not so much now, stronger links with your Western partners. Of course, you feel vulnerable, and then internally you have this lot of pro-Russian groups popping up, and they talking about now, that we should, reset the relation with Russia, and the West was not helping us. Something. This was something which was not possible, let's say 5-10 years ago, but now it's coming up. That's why we actually titled this name, that is Georgia losing strategic compass, because there's this feeling that we are kind of little bit not sure where we're moving, and this is exactly happening in very, very bad timing for this, and because again, the strategic window of opportunity was just opened up by this Ukrainian war. It will not last longer. So either Georgia will be in, To give you one example, when there was such strategic opportunity after end of Cold War, which Baltic states, they used very wisely. When Russia was weak and South Caucasus, we just didn't care and we started this conflict, so we just missed this. Now there's a second opportunity. If we lose this, we don't know when will be the third opportunity such. And then that's why we have to be very clear, and that's why we should have the strategic consensus inside among the political parties and to use this opportunity because it's also not excluded, as you know, there might be again kind of new Cold War, I don't know, borders or division. And where Georgia will be here? Will it be under Russian tutelage again, which Georgian people in public doesn't want, or it will be part of the whatever you call this greater Europe or West or whatever?
I think we should come back to that, but we'll take yet another question.
Yes, hello. My name is Pernille Rike, research professor here at NUPI. We have been in contact via email, never met, so I'm very happy to meet you and also very interesting to listen to you. So I have a question regarding going back to conditionality and the EU's role. It was interesting that you say that, you still believe in conditionality, and I also do that. But at the same time, we see that the EU has not been very successful in its conditionality policy. And you also said that to come out of this vendetta mindset, you need external help or assistance in any way. So I would like you to hear what you think the EU could do concretely, other than just putting up the 12 points that you have to fulfill, to assist you in getting out of this mindset, because that is we are working on a project that we didn't get funding, and that was about how to deal with hybrid democracies and hybrid regimes like Georgia, and that maybe some of the challenges for the EU is that they do not have enough competence on the dynamics of these societies. So would like to hear a little bit about your reflection about that. And the last question is about the European political community. Maybe you can say a little bit about how you view that as a new format for, at least not as a kind of a replacement for EU membership in the future, but at least as some way of organizing, having a European governance structure where that can help on the way towards maybe memberships in the future. Thank you.
Right, fantastic question. Thank you so much. I think there are at least two directions that the EU, together with other donors, could engage. First of all, it would be creating some sort of institutional framework that would create guarantees for the parties. But I think long term, and this is something that both donors and the parties have to think long term, for parties to get more linkages to their electorates, so that parties are not these sort of futile creations which really are not conveying the bottom-up interests. I get questions very often from my friends in Sweden, in Ukraine, about how come there is such a big difference between, on the one hand, electorates, which obviously supports Ukraine, which is obviously incredibly pro-European, and then the rhetoric of the ruling party, which Kornely was describing so nicely. There's a massive disconnect, which is really difficult to understand when we look from the Western European perspective, when we know that parties should be, again, vessels for aggregation of interests and then putting them on the political arena. So I think it should also include more of long-term strategies for just party institutionalization in the end of the day. I think that's really a long-term solution. But I think short-term, it's just, bringing parties together as much as possible and creating some sort of, I'm repeating myself, but I really think that that's the solution. And also, we know that together with conditionality, EU in the CE countries was very actively also using the socialization mechanisms. And I think this is something that the EU should use even more, sort of more people-to-people contact, more exchange for students, because I think that many people who return to Georgia from studying abroad, they have different mindset in many cases. And you know, in the end of the day, hopefully they will end up in politics at some day and have been tired of the vendetta approach. Yeah.
Just to add what Katie said, that for instance, you offered the Jean Monnet dialogue to Georgia government, and which was not utilized so far. So that's actually they offered already Serbia to other countries. So there's some this through European Parliament. So there's many ways how you can actually engage. If there's a political will, which is not there. And also just to give you our example, GAP now had a project for 1 year where we basically we are not just writing or observing, we also trying to promote this policy. Basically, what we started that we started to bring 10 political youth wings from all major political parties in Georgia, and to try to work with them how to work together in the issues of Europeanization, foreign policy, security issues. And there was a lot of taboo issues, and it was very difficult to bring all of them, because what they heard from the seniors, they don't trust each other. But during 1 year we managed now to have a quite good understanding among this group, and we now thinking this group actually thinking now to establish some sort of inter-party, some sort of youth council, where all these political parties, including GD and UNM, actually will manage time to time to communicate about the issues. So this is the way this should be replicated on senior level. Again, Georgia, this. I think that maybe I disagree here with Katie a little bit. That I think that. Support from the Western governments is unsustainable, neither from EU nor the US, because Georgia looks like kind of like small child which is not immature, and every time it's just asking for help. People got fed up, and there's some sort of Georgia fatigue now in Brussels and Washington DC. So that's why Georgians, we have to learn to sort out our problems on our own. If you created a problem, you have to solve this as a Georgian politician, and that's why we need to set up this some sort of this inter-party council where they time to time they will meet and they will sort. And as a Georgian citizen, I don't care what kind of disagreement they have. I just want to see that Georgia prospers as a member of European Union, that we will get candidate status, and that's the wish of the Georgian people. And if you look to the public opinion polls, this is what the people want. So they should just serve to this interest, and I think we should really push them towards this, and that's probably way out, because I don't think that, how many times, for instance, EU can interfere, in Georgia. You cannot do this all the time. And even though Georgians, we may think that we are center of the world, and it's not true. So, and there's a lot of other bigger problems in the world.
So EU can use sticks and carrots and facilitate, but in the end, reform has to take place inside.
Yeah, because most of the problems are homegrown, and you have to address this, domestically. And you cannot expect that all the time that external actors will solve all your problems.
I think there was a second part to your question, Pernille. Yes, and we didn't really get an answer to that.
Yeah, I think about this EPC, it's quite interesting, because it's a little bit, unfortunately, this is very late. If this initiative was like, proposed like 5 years ago, that would be very much needed. But now, when this country is a European perspective, it's kind of, it's still fine, because as you mentioned, if it will be, it will not somehow replace this, membership or anything. This is still fine, because this is what Georgia and countries like Ukraine and Moldova wanted. Because what we're missing as a part of Europe or Greater Europe, whatever you will call it, that we, even though formally we are kind of European neighbors, but we never had the opportunity to interact on societal level. For instance, with Europeans, we are not part of the huge discussion about European security, about the European future. So this should be part. There's of course something was done, like through Erasmus. There's now Erasmus generation in Georgia who actually feels very European, and they don't have any feeling there's a border between Europe and Georgia. But I think we need more involvement of these countries, these Eastern Partnership countries, in this pan-European discussion, and this was missing. And I hope this EPC probably will be one of the vehicles when they will actually feel, and this also will help a little bit to push for this societal contacts, which was missing. If you just ask now French farmer what they know about Georgia, or Norwegian farmer, not pretty much, and same thing. So I think we need to change this, and it could be a lot of work there.
Please.
Hi, thanks for your presentations. My name is Nika. I study human rights at the University of Oslo, and I have two questions. First, what are your thoughts about this political group that distanced themselves from the ruling party recently, and they are very vocal against ambassadors in the Western politics in general, and they are writing these letters? And the second question is about the upcoming elections. They're planned to be fully proportional. Do you think it's going to change something about polarization? It's going to affect it somehow? Thanks.
I can start. I think they are very much interconnected, at least in my mind. What I think about the people who distance themselves, I don't think that they are really that distant from the ruling party, and I think they are again more of two voices of the hardliners. I'm not sure if these people are actually hardliners or they are just, voicing opinions of other hardliners in the ruling party, but I don't see them as really that different from the ruling party. I've also, again, this is to some extent maybe speculation still, but I've also heard that they might just propose their own political party, which means that, and again, we had discussion about this yesterday with Kornely, that if they, pose themselves as opposition and as political party that's opposing ruling party, unfortunately that sort of gives the ruling party opportunity to, at some point, maybe after the next elections, to sort of join forces and pose as coalition government, while in reality there will be just two parts of the same ruling party.
So you have an end to polarization by uniting with yourself?
Yes.
So basically the idea is to have a satellite party, which actually was also, we had some similar under Saakashvili as well when there was another satellite party. So basically idea of the satellite party is to help the ruling party to stay in the power. So I think that this scenario is also not excluded. I also agree that, they are whatever they call this, first they were four amigos, and then, there's different names,
right?
They're calling, and they basically voicing something which, yes, these hardliners and probably also Mr. Ivanishvili wants to hear, and that's why they basically trying to, as I said, to blackmail West, somehow that if you will not heed our advice, then if you will not talk to us and if you will not interfere, then maybe we will even change a little bit, foreign policy course, or we will maybe do a little bit more with Russia rapprochement. And this is just, I don't think that's, possible, because again, public opinion is very strongly pro-Western, but at least they try. And it's unfortunately, this damages Georgia's reputation internally and externally, and that's what worries us all.
But Nika also asked about the proportional system. So you think it will not open up for a greater flora, or if there will be a greater flora, it will be more satellites from the two that will make it into the parliament, or what would be the impact, you think, of changing the election system?
I'm afraid that could be the case. If we look also at the previous parliament, there was this Patriots Alliance, right? That was, again, it was completely a separate party, but it was very much cooperating with GD on many issues, and they were incredibly pro-Russian, outspokenly. So if there are more parties like that, that of course gives the impression that GD is cooperating with other smaller parties, which is the definition of you could create coalition government with them.
Hi, my name is David Batsiashvili. I'm here. I'm representing Georgian diaspora organization, Kreba, newly established. No, I have a very short question about the. You just said that now ruling party is preparing for the next election, which will be held probably in 2024, right? Is there any signs that Georgian opposition or any parties are preparing for that elections? And if not, do you have, or if you have any recommendations, or I don't know?
I follow some of the party members on the Twitter and on social media, and I think it seems that they are, but so far I haven't seen any sort of tangible results of them really sort of coming together. I mean, the opposition parties coming together and, you know, at least deciding that some issues are, we just share these values and we will challenge the ruling party on these issues. Unfortunately, I have not seen that. And as I mentioned, there's also a rivalry between the opposition party members, right? Some of them are sort of splinters from the former UNM, and you could see also at the personal level how much there's a massive level of disagreement, which is not good for Georgia's democracy. But who knows? Maybe, you know, there's still a couple of years left. There's still some time. Maybe there will be something that will make them come together. But of course, one thing that we just have to keep in mind, that just like Kornely was mentioning, the really big problem that the EU and again all the other donors should keep in mind is the not only focus on the election day and election period, but pre-election period and how the ruling party, and it's a norm not just for the GD but for all the ruling parties, how they misuse the administrative resources, how they mobilize the, you know, teachers, law enforcement, a very, you know, who are supposed to be impartial bureaucrats, how they use these resources to win the elections.
Just to give you one example, what Katie was mentioning, that during the 2020 election, there was a presidential election when opposition candidate was actually ahead with 1% with the current president. So that was very tough, you know, like election. And I know there one case in the western part of Georgia where actually government lost in one region the votes, and for second you know round they tried to mobilize. They brought all officials in this region, and basically they came to one person who actually was the owner of the small bakery, and he had some influence in the village, and they promised him that this bakery actually had actually some debts, state debts, and they told him that if you will help us somehow to in this your village, you may get some concession with this debt. And this guy, I'm just telling you very briefly, but this guy just agreed, and he got rid of this debt. He had to just pay only 12,000 lari, and this happened just like 2 weeks before the election. And I'm just giving you how the international observer can find out about this kind of thing. And this is, I'm not saying this particular government invented this. This was there with former government and former. So I think what we need is the change of this political culture, because with this voter buying, influencing, using or intimidating voters or something, until this is acceptable for Georgian public and for Georgian you know, like citizens, I think we will not have any tangible results. It's not, of course, it's easy always to blame government or anything, but I think it should be culturally unacceptable for everybody. And unfortunately, I see that we are not there yet.
One thing that we have just briefly touched, but what I would like you to maybe say a few words about are the territorial conflicts, the breakaway regions, the so-called de facto states. Are there any prospects for establishing closer relations with these at the current stage? During the pandemic, the borders have been more closed than ever. Is there an opening up? Is there a possibility for greater engagement from the side of Tbilisi in these conflicts?
I think there's some opportunities right now. There, as you know, in these two occupied regions in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, we have a lot of Russian citizens, and it's not excluded that maybe they will be called for as a conscript. So this, of course, creates some anxiety in this society, and I think this is the right time for Tbilisi to engage with this kind of people, and especially to offer them, if they don't want to serve in Russian army, just to offer some sort of, you know, like alternatives in other parts of Georgia. So I think we really need to come with some sort of new ideas, but Unfortunately, Georgia became now so inward-looking country that we don't have any vision about region. We don't have even vision about the future of the conflicts. And so we are so much, even this Nagorno-Karabakh war just ended up that way that we didn't even notice. Our political class didn't notice it. You know, of course, the Ukrainian war a little bit woke up, but we are, again, how to say, spending all our energy for internal fighting. When what we need is we need to use this energy for to strengthen the Europeanization, democratic reforms, and other things. So I think I wish that there should be some vision, but I don't see this energy or some kind of new vision coming from the government. And it's also to be fair, it's not only job of the government. It should be part of civil society, academia, who should come with this kind of proposals. But I don't think that Georgia. I think that Georgia's focus is somewhere else now, and it's very internal.
We have time for a final question, I think.
Hello, my name is Mariam Sugaipova. I'm also here from NUPI. Thank you both for drawing this very nuanced analysis of the country. It's very interesting. I would like to bring this discussion a bit outside, but still related to the foreign policy and securitization. After the announcement of partial mobilization in Russia, we saw a large influx of Russian citizens across the border to Georgia, especially on land borders through Verkhny Lats. And there were messages, so my question would be twofold. There were messages from that people from the North Caucasus region of the Russian Federation especially were, ill-treated at the border and not allowed entrance into the Georgian side. So I'm wondering whether or not there exists any specific foreign policy reasons, security reasons for that. Do you have any opinion on that? And domestically, what is the overall public opinion on this large influx of the Russian citizens to Georgia? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to?
I can start with the last point. I would say the overall public opinion is very clearly negative. And if you would walk in the streets of Tbilisi, you would see lots of graffiti that Russians are not welcome. But I listened to a couple of interviews with Russians who moved there, and they were saying that even despite all of this, and we know that we're not welcome, but we still feel more secure here than living in Moscow or any other city where, if I protest, police could just beat me up or take me to prison. I think that's the approach. Regarding the government policy, maybe Kornely.
Yeah, I think the government has very strange policy. It's again the part of this very strange foreign policy. For instance, sometimes they deny the visa or entrance to Russian journalists, independent journalists, and sometimes they allow very bizarre, politicians or artists from Russia to enter to Georgia. So we don't understand the logic. Also, we don't understand why for instance, Northern Caucasian, citizens, they are not allowed. I don't know. Maybe there's security reason or whatever, but nobody explains that, publicly. No, we don't know that. And also, I think the attitude of the government is very ambivalent because, government is its position itself. It sees this as an opportunity for growth of economy and some other, like bringing investment. There was like 1,000 of, new companies registered after this Russian influx. So they just see it as an opportunity. But the public a little bit has a different opinion because some part of the public they support maybe because, like owners of the hotels, the restaurants, of course, they're benefiting from this. But this is not all Georgia. So for other Georgians, they try to look this from security point of view, and they see it not as an opportunity, but there's risks as well. Especially maybe short term, there's no risk so much, but in medium and long term, this may also bring some risks. And I think we need this calculation of risks. And I don't think that the government is there. What is government doing? They're just now trying to defend their interests of Russians. They publicly said this view officials. So that's why all this rhetoric doesn't have any logic at all. I mean, neither with Russia, neither with the West. So I think that's why all these roots coming from this internal politics, because the ruling party is now so much engaged to clinch power, to stay there, and because of this Vendetta rule and some other things, that they don't have any. You don't see any consistency. And again, that's why we have this title again, that is Georgia losing strategic compass, because this window opportunity is there. If we don't use this now, we may not have this kind of opportunity. So these two things are too interconnected. And I think we need strategic thinking of what Georgia needs to be done, and this should be done by political class. But unfortunately, we don't see that this is going that way.
So there you stole my final line, what I planned to say. So with that, I would like to thank Keti and Kornely for their sharing their insights here this morning, and for you in the audience for all your good questions. Thank you very much, and welcome back at a new seminar soon. Thank you.